Richard Nixon won the 1968 election, promising he had a secret plan to win the Vietnam War. This reminded people of how Eisenhower had brought the Korean War to an end after just 3 months in office. They hoped Nixon could do the same. In the early months of his presidency, he sent Henry Kissinger to North Vietnam to negotiate a settlement. He promised a massive escalation of the bombing campaign if an agreement could not be reached. However, Nixon's approach to Vietnam also ended in failure. Once in office, he found himself in the same position as Lyndon B. Johnson. He was confronted by an enemy determined to fight on no matter what he threatened. Ho Chi Minh had come to power as a communist leader in North Vietnam in 1945. He had fought the Japanese and the French in the intervening years. And although he died in September 1969, he had left behind a government determined to fight against all external forces in Vietnam. By 1968, the United States was spending over $70 billion a year in Vietnam. There were over 500,000 soldiers there, and about 300 soldiers were dying every week. In March 1969, Nixon put a secret plan into operation. It involved a massive escalation of the bombing campaign to include carpet bombing of communist strongholds in Cambodia and Laos, in order to cut off supplies to South Vietnam. However, the increased bombing soon led to increased anti-war protests at home and failed to make any real impact on North Vietnam. By June, Nixon offered to withdraw all US forces from South Vietnam if North Vietnam would do likewise. However, this offer was also rejected. By mid-1969, peace talks were ongoing in Paris but were making very little progress. By then, Nixon actually realised the war could not be won. By 1970, Nixon attempted to pursue a policy of negotiation and Vietnamization. It was hoped that a more intensive bombing campaign of North Vietnam would force them to agree to a neutral South Vietnam. At the same time, South Vietnamese forces would be trained to defend their own country as American forces began to withdraw. However, North Vietnam were not interested in such negotiation and were determined to fight on to unite their country as a total communist state. In February 1971, an operation known as Lam Son 719 took place. This was something of a test case to see if Vietnamization would work. Here, South Vietnam troops attacked North Vietnam forces in Laos and Cambodia with the help of US air support. However, after a couple of months, it was found to be a failure. Also at this time, the Pentagon Papers were released, which published a military analysis of the war. The American public found that they were not told the truth in regard to the progress of the war as a result of the Pentagon Papers. This in turn led to greater demands to get out of Vietnam. By late 1971 and throughout 1972, South Vietnam was found to be too weak to defend itself as US troops began to leave the territory. Henry Kissinger, as head of the National Security Council, was the principal American negotiator. Le Doc Tho represented North Vietnam. Eventually, an agreement was reached in Paris known as the Paris Accords in January 1973. The Accords were basically a flawed agreement. They agreed basically a ceasefire agreement which allowed the American troops to withdraw. As soon as they left, however, the fighting resumed between North and South Vietnam. Over the next couple of years, fighting continued. 2 years later, a massive North Vietnam offensive captured South Vietnam in April 1975. And 2 years later, the two countries united in July 1976 as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The United States lost 58,000 men in the Vietnam War. About 150,000 others were wounded. The nation spent over $120 billion on the conflict. About 2 million Vietnamese, between civilians and military, were also killed. The Vietnam War has been called the biggest foreign policy mistake in US history. The best that can be said for Richard Nixon is that he didn't start it. However, he failed to take appropriate action when it was clear after about 6 months as president that the US could not win. And the war went on for another 4 or 5 years after that. Elsewhere, Nixon had greater levels of success in relation to foreign policy. Early in his presidency, he made it known through his top diplomat, Henry Kissinger, that he wanted better relations with China. On the 15th of July 1971, there was a dramatic breakthrough announcement from both Washington and Beijing. Nixon would visit China in the following February. This was intended to pressurize the Soviets, who were already involved in a serious conflict with China in a border dispute. Nixon agreed to a one-China policy, which in turn led to Taiwan being replaced by the People's Republic as China at the United Nations in October 1971. China therefore became one of the 5 permanent nations of the UN Security Council. They also agreed on a joint communique which recognised a one China policy through peaceful means. Contact with China also had a positive impact on US-Soviet relationships. On the 22nd of May 1972, just 3 months later, Nixon was in Moscow for a summit meeting with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. They agreed to 2 major treaties and a number of minor ones. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, was an important treaty between the superpowers. They both agreed to limit the production of nuclear weapons. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM, was also of crucial importance. It committed both powers to ban the creation of systems designed to intercept incoming missiles. They also signed agreements in relation to space, science and trade. These agreements helped to relax relationships between the superpowers and are collectively known as détente. Nixon also developed an idea he called triangular diplomacy. He hoped to play China against the Soviets and vice versa, and play both against North Vietnam. However, his ideas failed to materialize in practice. He found he could not undermine Vietnam. Also, the treaties agreed with both the Soviets and China were probably of more benefit to them than to the United States. The People's Republic of China was very happy to replace Taiwan at the UN and become a permanent member of the Security Council. Likewise, the Soviets were happy to sign an arms limitation treaty as they were finding it extremely difficult to keep up with the Americans anyway, as later events proved. In relation to South America, Nixon authorized the overthrow of socialist President Salvador Allende in Chile. Allende was seen to be too closely connected to the Soviet Union and a possible threat to US interests in the region. The CIA was involved in an operation which removed Allende in September 1973. He was replaced by General Pinochet. The American government supported Pinochet in the following years. He formed a number of death squads which killed thousands of political opponents. In relation to foreign affairs generally, Nixon developed a set of ideas known as the Nixon Doctrine. Following the disastrous experience in Vietnam, America would support allies by producing high-quality arms for sale, but avoiding actual combat. For example, in the Yom Kippur War of late 1973, 2 Arab powers, Egypt and Syria, attacked Israel. This conflict almost erupted into a conflict between the superpowers, as the Soviet Union threatened to support its Arab allies. However, the Soviets backed down as Kissinger and Nixon ordered a military DEFCON 3 situation whereby all US military bases were put on alert for a possible nuclear war. The Arab nations responded to this situation by forming OPEC and refusing to sell crude oil to the US, thereby causing the oil crisis of the mid-70s. In relation to domestic policy, Nixon's major change in financial policy was to allow the dollar to float against other currencies on the international markets in 1971. At that time, the US was running a persistent balance of payments deficit, which was a drain on the country's gold reserves. Nixon hoped to stabilise the economy and address the trade imbalance. This decision brought the gold standard to an end effectively. In January 1970, the Environmental Policy Act was passed through Congress, and in April, 3 months later, 1970, the first Earth Day revealed an enormous level of support for environmental issues. Nixon responded to this situation by establishing the Environmental Protection Agency. In May, he also supported the Clean Air Act. In the following years, over 100 countries around the world developed environmental policies modelled largely on the United States Environmental Protection Agency. In regard to healthcare, in 1973, Nixon supported a Healthcare Act which obliged employers with more than 35 employees to provide them with healthcare insurance. In regard to civil rights, in 1971, the Supreme Court ruled in favour of busing in Swan versus Charlotte. Nixon supported integration of children in education. This issue had been settled in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the practical application of it was still an ongoing issue. Busing of children from outside their areas in order to implement integration became an explosive issue in some areas of the South. Nixon set up a task force headed by Vice President Agnew to supervise the process. He wanted to follow a moderate course so that he could encourage Southern whites to support the Republican Party. The most spectacular achievement during the Nixon presidency was the moon landing on the 20th of July 1969. Millions of people around the world actually watched Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk and dance on the surface of the moon. It was the United States' greatest development in technological terms and elevated the country to first place in terms of international achievement in technology. In regard to the Watergate affair, with the Vietnam War still raging in 1972, Nixon feared for his chance of being re-elected that November. So in June 1972, 5 months before the election, 5 men were caught in a break-in the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in Washington. Some members of the break-in were members also of Nixon's re-election team. Nixon later tried to cover up their involvement. However, later investigations revealed the existence of a tape recording system in the White House. The Supreme Court ordered the release of these tapes. Nixon's direct involvement in the cover-up became undeniable. The scandal had wide-ranging implications and forced Nixon to resign as he had lost the support of the Senate. Watergate is also considered to be a defining moment in American history. In regard to his life and legacy, Richard Nixon is considered one of the most influential figures in American history. He was born in Gorba Linda in California in 1913. He was elected to Congress for the first time in 1946. In the early years, he developed a reputation as a strong anti-communist, creating a national reputation in relation to the Alger Hiss case in the late 40s. He became Vice President Dwight D. Eisenhower between 1953 and 61. In regard to his personal life, he married Pat Ryan. They had 2 daughters. Now, Richard Nixon died in 1994, having written 10 books in retirement, including his memoirs. He is considered by historians and indeed in public surveys as to be one of the worst American presidents, mainly because of his failure in regard to the Vietnam War and the scandalous end to his presidency in the Watergate affair.